In October of 1991, a field volunteer named Carl Lemon was working a dig site in eastern Utah when he found what he assumed was a curved rib bone. He called over the paleontologist running the site, James Kirkland, expecting maybe a passing nod. Kirkland took one look and realized Lemon hadn't found a rib at all. It was the tip of a claw, and going by its size alone, it belonged to something built on a scale nobody working that formation had any reason to expect. Kirkland's own words to describe the moment years later were blunt. They'd found a Dromaeosaurid claw twice the size of Deinonychus's. If you watched last time, you already know what that comparison means. Deinonychus was the animal that convinced science dinosaurs could be fast, active predators instead of sluggish reptiles. Whatever this new claw belonged to was built on a completely different scale, and its story turns out to involve a movie deal, a corporate legal threat, a decade spent excavating a single 9-ton rock, and a scientific debate that still hasn't fully closed. Kirkland wasn't working alone. The dig was co-led with Robert Gaston and Donald Burge, sponsored by what's now the Prehistoric Museum in Price, Utah. And this wasn't even technically the first piece of this animal anyone had found. Back in 1975, paleontologist Jim Jensen had recovered fragments of the same species at a site called Dalton Wells Quarry, near Moab, but the material was too incomplete at the time for anyone to recognize what it was. It took the 1991 dig at what became known as the Gaston Quarry and rock belonging to the Yellow Cat and Poison Strip members of the Cedar Mountain Formation, and one volunteer misreading a claw for a rib to actually put the pieces together. Kirkland brought a plaster cast of the claw to a paleontology conference in San Diego about a week later. He showed it first to Robert Backer, the same paleontologist whose illustrations had helped define the modern athletic image of Deinonychus decades earlier. Backer, by Kirkland's account, was skeptical and guessed it might just be a crushed claw from a completely different, already known predator called Torvosaurus. Kirkland then brought it to John Ostrom himself, the paleontologist behind Deinonychus, and Ostrom's red was the opposite of skeptical. In Kirkland's telling, Ostrom confirmed immediately that this was the real thing, a genuinely giant Dromaeosaurid. How old is the rock this animal came out of? Here's a case where being honest about a moving scientific target matters more than picking one clean number and moving on. Kirkland's original 1993 description, along with most of the popular science writing that followed it for the next 2 decades, placed the find in the Borromean to Aptian stages, roughly 130 to 125 million years ago. Then, in 2019, a team led by Jokel published refined radiometric dating using uranium-lead zircon analysis alongside pollen evidence, and the number moved considerably. Their figures placed the yellow cat member at approximately 139 to nearly 135 million years old, pushing the formation, and this animal along with it, back into the Berriasian and Valanginian stages, meaningfully older than the figure that had been repeated in print for a quarter of a century. Current sources generally cite a range of roughly 135 to 139 million years ago. It's a good early reminder for this whole story. Even a number as basic as how old a fossil is can move by several million years once better dating techniques catch up to the original estimate. Now, the naming. This is where the story gets stranger than almost anything else on this channel, and it starts with an accident of timing that nobody involved could have planned. When Jurassic Park hit theaters in 1993, its on-screen velociraptors were, as we covered last time, actually built off Deinonychus's real proportions, just scaled up roughly 3 times larger for dramatic effect, since the filmmakers wanted something more imposing than the real turkey-sized Velociraptor mongoliensis. Kirkland's new Utah Dromaeosaurid hadn't even been formally described yet when the movie came out. And once it was, people immediately noticed the coincidence. This newly discovered, genuinely enormous Dromaeosaurid was landing at almost exactly the size the movie had invented for its fictional raptors, purely by accident, since the fossil had been sitting in the ground for well over 100 million years before Michael Crichton ever wrote a word. Kirkland leaned directly into that coincidence. His original plan was to name the animal Utahraptor SpielbergA, honoring Steven Spielberg, partly as a nod to the uncanny size match and partly, by his own account, for the publicity value. The Price Museum was confident enough in the plan that it printed hundreds of t-shirts reading Utahraptor SpielbergA ahead of the official announcement. Then, less than 2 weeks before the paper was set to publish, Kirkland's employer at the time, a company called Dynamation that built animatronic dinosaur exhibits for museums, told him to change the name. The issue wasn't a dispute over rights to the word Utahraptor itself. It was that Universal Studios had started threatening legal action against museums using the word Jurassic in their own unrelated exhibit names. And since many of Dynamation's clients were exactly those kinds of museums, the company didn't want to be seen publicly courting a Spielberg connection while that legal pressure was active. Kirkland renamed the species days before publication, honoring two people instead. John Ostrom, discoverer of Deinonychus and the paleontologist who'd personally confirmed the claw was genuine, and Chris Mays, the president of Dynamation, whose company had funded the research. The species was published in June of 1993 in the journal Huntaria as Utahraptor ostromaci. There's a coda to the naming that's still genuinely unresolved, which feels appropriate for an animal whose whole identity started with a near miss. In 2000, researcher George Olszewski argued the species name should technically be spelled Dromaeosaurum, a Latin plural genitive construction, since it honors two separate people rather than one, and that version is now the spelling used on most current museum labels and in a lot of recent literature. But a 2019 paper by Costa and David, published in the Bulletin of Zoological Nomenclature, argued that emendation isn't actually valid under the formal rules of zoological naming, since there's no properly constructed genitive plural form for combining two different people's names the way Olszewski did it, and that the original 1993 spelling, Ostromaci, should be the one that stands. Both spellings are still genuinely in active use across current scientific literature. Nobody's fully settled it. Given all that, it's honestly fitting that even this animal's name is still being argued about. So, what did they actually have once the dust settled? Kirkland's original 1993 description estimated an animal around 7 meters long, with a body mass somewhat under 500 kilograms, a comparison he made directly to a modern polar bear. Over the following 2 decades, that number came down substantially as more material and more rigorous scaling methods were applied. Various studies scaled it closer to 6 meters, then closer to 5, with body mass estimates in the 350 to 450 kilogram range, based on comparisons to a similarly sized Mongolian Dromaeosaurid called a kilobator. A 2019 estimate for the largest confirmed specimen put it at around 4.9 meters and 280 kilograms. For a while, the honest scientific consensus was that Kirkland's original 1993 numbers had probably been generous. Then, in 2024, a study led by Pintore, examining femur strength and proportions across giant theropods, revised several individual Utahraptor specimens' mass estimates upward again, in some cases dramatically. One specimen came out around 391 kilograms, another around 481. A third, cataloged as BYU-VP 7510-18078, came out at approximately 777 kilograms, nearly matching Kirkland's original polar bear comparison from 3 decades earlier. What that tells you isn't that any single number is definitively correct. It's that this animal's size estimate has genuinely swung in both directions as the field's tools have improved, down through most of the 2000s and 2010s, then back up again in specific individual cases as of 2024. What's stayed constant through all of it is the comparison that actually matters most. The largest confirmed Utahraptor femur on record measures between 56.5 and 60 centimeters, roughly 15 centimeters longer than the equivalent bone in a kilobator, its closest sized relative. Whatever the exact weight turns out to be, Utahraptor remains, by direct skeletal measurement, the largest confirmed Dromaeosaurid ever found, meaningfully bigger than Deinonychus, and in an entirely different size class from the actual velociraptor. The claw that started all of this measures about 22 centimeters along its outer curve as preserved, with the complete structure in life estimated at around 24 centimeters, close to 9.5 inches, on a single toe. It's worth being precise about what science can and can't currently say about how that claw was actually used. because the popular image, the Jurassic Park image, of a raptor leaping onto prey and slashing its belly open, doesn't hold up well against the most rigorous testing available. The most detailed biomechanical study on this specific claw shape comes from a 2019 paper by Bishop, published in the journal PeerJ, using a CT scan-based musculoskeletal model to test 7 different hypotheses for how these curved Dromaeosaurid claws functioned. Everything from slash-kicking at range to driving the claw downward, using body weight to targeting the throat directly. It's worth flagging that the specific model was built from Dinosaur material, not Utahraptor, since no equivalent Utahraptor-specific biomechanical study has been published yet. But Utahraptor shares the same basic claw architecture, so the finding is considered broadly applicable across this whole family of dinosaurs. The result was fairly one-sided. Only one hypothesis held up under testing: a flexed, crouched grip used to restrain and pin down prey, comparable to how a modern hawk or eagle uses its talons, not to slash or to swing the claw through open air with any real force. Extended, kicking postures barely generated any usable force at the claw tip at all. That finding builds on earlier work using a physical robotic foot model, which pointed toward puncturing and gripping over slashing, and it lines up with what's become known as the raptor prey restraint model. The idea that these animals pinned struggling prey to the ground with their feet while the jaws and forelimbs did the actual work of killing it. For an animal built as heavily as Utahraptor specifically, Kirkland's original description speculated that its greater bulk might have let it deliver forceful kicks without needing its arms purely for balance, the way lighter, more agile relatives may have needed to, freeing its arms to help hold prey in place. That's a plausible idea from the original paper, not a tested biomechanical result, and it's worth being upfront about that distinction. The overall picture that's emerged from later reviews, including Gregory Paul's 2016 assessment, treats Utahraptor less as a fast pursuit predator and more as a powerfully built ambush hunter, relying on its jaws as much as its claws once prey was actually pinned. Now for the part of the story that's genuinely still unfolding, more than 3 decades after that first claw came out of the ground. In 2001, a bone was spotted protruding from a hillside at a site that became known as Styke's Quarry, in the same yellow cat member of the Cedar Mountain Formation, in an area that's now part of Utahraptor State Park. What paleontologists eventually recognized was that this wasn't a single isolated bone. It was one small exposed piece of a 9-ton block of extremely dense sandstone, packed with the remains of multiple individuals. Getting that block out of the hillside intact took over a decade of careful, painstaking work. It was finally dragged free of the mountainside in the fall of 2014, and in March of 2015, it was transported to Thanksgiving Point's Museum of Ancient Life in Lehi, Utah, the only regional facility equipped to handle preparation on a block that large. And here's the detail that tends to surprise people. Getting the block out of the ground wasn't the hard part. Actually extracting individual bones from rock this dense, without damaging them, has taken years longer, led primarily by preparator Scott Madsen, with more than 3,500 hours of documented preparation work, completed as of the most recent figures available. Much of it funded through public crowdfunding after state funding, for the project lapsed, including a single donation, over $50,000 that drew national coverage. As of the most recent reporting I can confirm, officials involved with the project describe having only scratched the surface of what's actually inside that block. And what's inside keeps growing the longer preparation continues, which is itself worth sitting with for a second, because it means the full scientific picture of this discovery is still being written in real time, not settled decades ago, the way it is for most of the animals we've covered on this channel. Early reporting around 2015 and 2016 described at least 6 individuals preserved in the block: 1 adult, 4 juveniles, and a single hatchling, alongside the remains of at least 1 plant-eating iguanodontian. By the late 2000s, official figures from the Utah Geological Survey had grown considerably, describing at least 1 adult, 10 juveniles, and 3 babies, 14 individual Utahraptors total. By early 2021, after further preparation turned up new partial skulls and the first complete adult shoulder girdle recovered from the block, officials suggested the true number preserved inside could be roughly double what had previously been assumed. I want to be straightforward about the limits of what I can confirm here. I could not verify a single final, settled count as of the most current information available, because as far as the record shows, this block is still being worked and the number has changed nearly every time someone's looked closely enough to recount it. So why were that many individuals, spanning ages from newborn to full adult, all buried together in the same spot? This is the actual heart of the ongoing scientific debate, and it's worth resisting the pull toward whichever answer makes the better story, because the honest current answer is that it isn't settled. In 2016, Kirkland, along with Simpson, Debleu, Madsen, Bogner, and Tybur, published a detailed geological analysis of the site in the journal Paleontology, concluding that the block represents what's called a dewatering feature, essentially an ancient patch of quicksand-like sediment liquefaction. The reconstruction is that one or more iguanodontian herbivores got mired in the wet sediment first, and that Utahraptors of varying ages were subsequently drawn toward the trapped, struggling prey, whether to scavenge or actively hunt it, and were themselves progressively caught and buried in the same trap. It's directly comparable to other well-documented predator trap sites, including Utah's own Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry and the La Brea Tar Pits in California. Both places where predators drawn to already trapped prey ended up trapped themselves in large numbers, entirely independent of each other, with no social relationship required at all. Here's the part that matters most for getting this right, rather than just telling the more exciting version. The published geological paper is explicit that whether all of these Utahraptors were mired at the same time or drawn into the same trap, individually over some unknown stretch of time, is not something the current evidence can resolve. And that distinction changes the entire behavioral story. If they were caught together, it opens up a real possibility of genuine social behavior. Animals of different ages traveling or hunting as a group. Maybe even active parental care extending well past hatching. If they were drawn in separately over time, the same way unrelated predators over centuries ended up stacked in the La Brea pits without ever having met each other, then the different ages found together tell you essentially nothing about whether this species was social at all. We ran into almost exactly the same problem 2 videos ago with Deinonychus, where multiple individuals found near a single, large prey animal were originally read as evidence of coordinated pack hunting until later isotope evidence complicated that story considerably, suggesting something closer to competitive, opportunistic feeding than cooperative teamwork. That earlier finding is now regularly cited as a reason for caution whenever a Dromaeosaurid site turns up multiple ages in one place, including this one. As of right now, the honest answer for Utahraptor is that paleontologists have a well-supported geological explanation for why the site formed the way it did, and a genuinely open question about what the animals inside it were actually doing there. There's one more thread worth pulling before we close this out, because it connects directly back to something we've now brought up twice in a row without ever actually confirming it. No feather impressions or any other direct soft tissue evidence have been found associated with Utahraptor. That's a plain fact, not a hedge. But the case for this animal being feathered anyway rests on the same logic we use for Deinonychus. Quill knobs, the small bumps on a forearm bone that anchor feathers in living birds, have been directly confirmed on Velociraptor, a close relative within this same family, and filamentous, feather-like coverings show up across multiple related Dromaeosaurids and their nearest outgroups in the fossil record, since feathers appear to have evolved once in the common ancestor of this entire group, rather than independently in each species, and there's no clear evidence of any large Dromaeosaurid losing them again. The standard inference is that Utahraptor almost certainly carried some kind of feathered covering too, most likely simple filaments rather than large, flight-capable feathers, given its size and the fact that it obviously never flew. What makes this particular animal worth watching closely going forward is that the same exceptional preservation conditions that kept an entire family's worth of skeletons intact inside that sandstone block have researchers on the Utahraptor project openly hopeful that direct feather impressions could eventually turn up as preparation continues. Nothing like that has been found yet, as far as any current source confirms. But if it happens, it would be the first direct feather evidence for this specific animal rather than an inference borrowed from its relatives, And given how much of this story has already changed since 1993, that genuinely doesn't feel like an unreasonable thing to hope for. In May of 2025, Utahraptor State Park formally opened to the public, built around the same stretch of Utah desert where Jim Jensen found the first unrecognized fragments in 1975, and where the mega block itself was pulled out of the ground in 2014, with James Kirkland himself leading tours at the opening. It's a genuinely fitting place for this story to have landed. An animal whose real size accidentally matched a movie's fictional exaggeration before it even had a name, whose actual name got rewritten days before publication because of a corporate legal dispute that had nothing to do with dinosaurs, and whose most important fossil discovery is still, more than 2 decades after it came out of the ground, not fully taken apart. Alright, since we've now covered 2 Dromaeosaurids in a row and both stories kept circling back to feathers nobody's actually found on either animal directly, next time we're covering a dinosaur where that particular problem doesn't apply. Utahraptor, a tyrannosauroid the size of a city bus, where researchers didn't have to infer feathers from a relative. They found the actual feather impressions on an animal roughly 40 times heavier than any feathered dinosaur discovered before it, and what that does to the modern image of Tyrannosaurus rex. That one's next. Let me know in the comments what you want cataloged after that, and subscribe to Claw Catalog so you're here for it.